I'm Glenn Gaviola, Program Director of the Diagnostic Radiology Residency Program. I'm happy to talk to you today as part of the Brigham Education Institute, looking at quantitative and qualitative approaches in medical education research. So, when we compare and contrast quantitative versus qualitative approaches to research, really, the quantitative approach is really concerned with discovering facts about social phenomena, whereas a qualitative approach is really looking to understand human behavior from the informant's perspective. In quantitative approaches, we assume a fixed and measurable reality, whereas qualitative approaches assumes a more dynamic and negotiated reality. Generally, for quantitative approaches, the data is collected through measuring things, analyzing using comparisons and statistical inferences, and reporting using statistical analyses. Whereas in qualitative approaches, data is collected through participant observation and interviews. It's analyzed by identifying themes from descriptions by our informants or our study subjects, and the data is reported in the language of the informant themselves. So, if we boil it down to the questions that we ask, quantitative approaches really look at questions of what, when, and where, whereas qualitative approaches really look at questions related to how and why. And in general, quantitative approaches thus test a hypothesis, whereas qualitative approaches really generate a hypothesis. So now we're going to take a look in depth about the differences between qualitative and quantitative approaches, looking at how do we collect the data, how do we analyze the data, and looking at what does the data tell you. With qualitative approaches, how we collect the data really is important in that the data is gathered from the point of view of the study participant. So this is usually in the form of observations or field notes, reflexive journals, doing interviews or focus groups, or reviewing documents or responses to open-ended questions and comments, usually through surveys. This could be done either with individuals or groups of individuals, and oftentimes the data is recorded and later transcribed for analysis. The selection of the participant is usually purposeful in that you want to gather representatives and outliers. So you want a good representation of the study group so that the sample size is appropriate so that you can reach data saturation, in which data is identified until there's no new data available. So in essence, there's really this myth of objectivity in which you really want to get as much information as possible. So oftentimes remains difficult to be objective. So here's an example from the Journal of Graduate Medical Education in 2015, looking at barriers and facilitators to effective feedback, a qualitative analysis of data from multi-specialty resident focus groups. And as part of how they collected this data, they looked at the barriers and facilitators to feedback seeking in residents, polling 4 different specialties at 3 different teaching institutions. And the sites were selected for geographic diversity and differences in the education programs. And you'll notice that there was a wide variety of different representations. And the goal was to have 8 to 10 participants in each group using focus groups that were conducted using open-ended questions. And questions were then used as a framework for the discussion, but again, probes were used to help steer the conversation. So with qualitative approaches, how do we analyze the data? After the focus group and interviews are transcribed and verified, it is then an iterative process, followed by 3 different distinct concepts. Number 1 is deconstruction. The goal here is to read and reread transcripts and break down data into categories or codes describing the content. Then, following deconstruction is interpretation, whereas categories and codes across different variables are compared and try to identify similarities and differences. Then data is reconstructed. The codes are reconstructed to show relationships from the interpretation stage with the idea of identifying general concepts or arching themes or sub-themes to basically identify your theory. So how is this gathered? So let's take an example how we would analyze the data. So we reviews the residency applications of our current residents in the open-ended section describing their hobbies and interests. And you'll notice with this world crowd, you'll see the different types of activities, hobbies, and interests that they listed. Our goal then to analyze this data would be to identify the phrases or behaviors or terms and identify themes that come from it. So if we look at this, we'll notice that there are certain themes that do emerge. So sports and physical activity seems to be a big dominant theme when we look at topics like running, football, hiking, yoga. Also, you'll notice that spending time with family and friends and people is also an important part of their hobbies and interests. I'm sure as you look at this data even further, you'll be able to identify additional themes that will arise from their interests. There are two overarching theories that are common in the literature for how we analyze the data. Grounded theory is based on the inductive process of identifying analytical categories as they emerge from the data. Thus, the goal is from the ground up, developing a hypothesis. So, in our last example, if we use a grounded theory model, we would identify that part of the hobbies and interests of our residents requires physical activity. As part of the analysis, we can also use the concept of constant comparison. In this case, each item is checked or compared with the rest of the data to try and establish the analytical categories. And over time, data can be reduced and refined by grouping together fuzzy categories, things that may be unclear. You'll see using the link to the YouTube video before an example of how constant comparison methods are used. So let's take an example from the medical literature. Again, this is from the Journal of Graduate Medical Education in December 2016. This qualitative study looked at the promotion of resident autonomy during family-centered rounds using a qualitative study of resident, hospitalist, and subspecialty physicians. You'll notice in their data set, they were able to provide the strategies and the hypotheses based on different themes that were identified from these focus group interviews. You'll notice as part of their transcript, they were able to take quotations and answers from different residents and use those to identify different themes. And the themes emerged were related to the timing of the rounds, either at the start of the rotation, before, or during, and then the exact concept associated with those. So you'll see here at the start of the rotation, themes emerging about framing expectations and using nonverbal signals were important. Before rounds, a pre-round huddle and detailed planning were important. And during family-centered rounds, deliberate positioning, delegating responsibilities, allowing flexibility, and probing for rationale for decision-making were important themes. So what does the data tell you? Again, it's important to understand that what we're really achieving is answering questions to how and why. So rather than looking at cause and effect, which is much more related to quantitative analysis and looking at things such as how much or numerics, we're really looking at how and why. It's important to understand the differences and look at outliers and cases and understand that there's multiple views of a complex reality than a single truth with the reductionist approach of quantitative approaches. In general, our goal is to generate a hypothesis that can then be tested. The data can also be qualitatively assessed, whereas in quantitative measures, we're really looking at validity. In qualitative methods, we're looking at authenticity. And oftentimes, this requires data triangulation with multiple sources to really identify whether information is truly authentic or an outlier. Again, reliability is a way of assessing quantitative data, whereas trustworthiness is what we really look for with qualitative data and looking at the quality of the data analysis. Another example from the Journal of Graduate Medical Education, looking at a qualitative study of internal medicine and pediatric resident perceptions of rounds today. And you'll notice that, again, the goal of the study was to generate hypotheses. So looking at this particular paper, they perceived that rounds had four broad purposes after conducting these focus groups. The purposes of patient care, clinical education, patient-family involvement, and assessment, and that influence of time pressures and diverse needs were conflicting. And they subsequently had strategies for different types of members of teams. So for both faculty, for residents, and program directors, of how rounds can be much more useful. In addition to qualitative data, you can have quantitative data as well, looking at the study population and the breakdown between the different types of groups that were represented from the focus groups. So in essence, many studies can be both quantitative and qualitative.